Hello and welcome to the Political History of the United States. Episode 4.54, The Campaign of 1779. Welcome back. Before we dive into the episode for today, I wanted to make a quick note about my last episode. As I'm sure many of you noticed, my voice did not really hold up through the entire episode. That is a result of me getting sick in between the time that I recorded the episode and the time that I came back and edited the episode. Try as I might, my voice was just not having any of it. So I apologize if the episode sounded a little bit below average. I am much healthier now, and let's get into the story for today. Last time, we spent our episode looking at the changing state of the war. At the end of 1778, the British launched what would become known as their Southern Strategy. The idea that they might be able to secure enough loyalty in the South so that they could pry away those colonies became the new order of the day. Launching in the final days of the year, the British were able to capture Savannah without much trouble. We likewise talked about the political position of both the United States and Great Britain during the early part of 1779, specifically looking at the campaign of intense finger-pointing that had consumed London at the start of the year. 1779 is different from any year that we have discussed so far during the war. Rather than being marked by action, it would become characterized for its decided lack of action. This week we are going to spend our time looking at the fighting that did take place, primarily between the Americans and the British allied tribes. We should be able to cover all of the fighting for an entire year today. Before we move on, I want to give you all a bit of a roadmap of where we are heading for the rest of this season. Now, as I said a moment ago, I could probably cover all of 1779 in a single episode today. So I'm going to take advantage of the seeming lull in action to touch on a few other subjects. I've got 2 episodes that I want to delve into that are not strictly going to fit into the narrative. First, there is going to be an episode on the various state constitutions that were being drafted and ratified during the war. Second, I am planning an episode that is going to look at the Loyalists and exactly how they fit into all of this. From there, we are going to move into 1780 and the endgame of the Revolution. The 4th season of this podcast is going to end after the Battle of Yorktown in 1781. I am well aware that the season now stands at 54 episodes. However, I am pleased to say that I can see the end in sight. We are not there quite yet, but the end of the American Revolution is now clearly visible on the horizon. However, we still have some more work to do before we get to wrap this war up once and for all. So for now, let's head back to the battlefields of 1779. There are several theaters of the war that I want to cover today. Among these, we are going to need to talk about George Washington and New York, a few naval engagements, and finally, the Spanish joining the war. Most of these things were relatively limited in scope, with the exception of the Spanish joining the war. As such, we should be able to move through each of these topics relatively quickly. I'm really not lying to you when I say that all the action in 1779 was far more limited than what we have seen in the previous years. To begin for today, though, I want to start with what was the biggest front in the war in 1779, specifically the battle along the frontiers against the Iroquois. The American Revolution was nothing short of a catastrophe for the Iroquois. By this point, it should go without saying that European wars seldom turned out well for the Iroquois. The Americans had openly been ignoring the proclamation line that George III had put in place back at the end of the French and Indian War, a boundary originally devised during the Easton Peace Conference. In New York, the Mohawk were actively chafing under increased encroachment into their lands by westward settlers. Joseph Brant, a Mohawk leader and the brother-in-law to the now-deceased Indian Superintendent William Johnson, traveled to London to plead his case directly. Now, unfortunately for Brant, his meetings with the British officials came in 1775, so right at the moment when the Americans had decided to steal all of the British attention. Immediately following the beginning of the war, both the British and the Americans alike quickly moved to treat with the Iroquois tribes. An alliance would have obviously been great, but really the goal initially was to go the far safer route of attempting to secure neutrality. The truth, however, is that neutrality was never going to be a meaningful possibility for the Iroquois. They were too close to the action. Their economy too tied into trade with the British colonists. British colonists who, now, were openly declaring that they were no longer British colonists, but rather a brand new polity. Upon his return to North America, Joseph Brant commented that the Iroquois were stuck in a position where both the British and the Americans demanded nothing short of absolute loyalty. At one point, this had included the Americans marching a small force through Mohawk lands. When the Mohawk complained, they were politely encouraged to remain neutral in the matter, as it didn't concern them. And oh, by the way, if you attempt to stop the march, we are going to burn your houses to the ground. Historian David Preston, in his book The Texture of Contact, explains that during the French and Indian War, the nature of Iroquois politics meant that small splinters of the Confederacy could break away and ally themselves with either the British or the French. Now, however, what we see is rather than small individual groups making alliances, entire nations of the Six Nations were making that decision, individually. As the war raged on and the Iroquois were increasingly dragged into the fighting, the Oneidas and Tuscaroras chose to ally themselves with the Americans, whereas the other four tribes ultimately would form alliances with the British. This means that the American Revolution had now become an Iroquois civil war, breaking up a mostly peaceful coexistence between the member tribes. Fighting along the frontiers had slowly ramped up during the war, and by 1778, combined Loyalist and Indian forces were busy launching a far more extensive campaign against the Pennsylvania and New York frontiers. These attacks, in addition to being brutal, also forced the Americans to tie up their precious resources trying to get control over the situation along those frontiers. What emerged was a series of increasingly brutal attacks that would leave scores dead on both sides, as American settlements and Indian villages alike found themselves being burnt to the ground, their inhabitants being murdered and scalped. In 1778, in the Wyoming Valley, John Butler led a mixed force of Indians and Loyalists on a mission that saw hundreds of Americans killed and settlements completely destroyed. Months later, Joseph Brant led an attack against the settlement of Cherry Valley, destroying the village and leaving dozens of civilians dead in its wake. The Americans through 1778 led similar attacks on Indian settlements, as American forces often targeted the always precarious food supply. As news of these attacks, and specifically the Wyoming Valley incident, made its way through the American press, a bad situation grew worse, as the story took on a life independent of the actual events. The American forces in the Wyoming Valley had suffered a very serious defeat. Following their surrender, the Allied Indians did take the opportunity to do some pillaging, despite guarantees by John Butler to respect property. The evidence from that day, however, coming directly from the American commander on the scene, Zebulon Butler, said that although personal property was certainly not respected, the pillaging stopped there and no additional Americans were injured or killed. It was this incident, however, that would prove to be the thing that the press focused on, and soon tales of inhumane massacres in the Wyoming Valley spread throughout all of the states. The stories of the massacres in the Wyoming and Cherry Valley respectively became oft repeated throughout the United States, their brutality becoming a point of focus in the ongoing propaganda blitz that had been going throughout the entire war. Historian Robert Parkinson explains that such imagery became increasingly important during these years, as the exhaustion and ongoing financial distress caused by the war had everybody feeling just a bit worn out. Much like Jay McCrae in 1777, these incidents helped inject an energy into the war that by 1779 was dragging on seemingly endlessly. As the war moved into 1779, the Americans were well aware of the necessity to secure the frontiers. With the British forces becoming more dispersed going into 1779, with half their army being stripped away entirely, and then the remainder split between New York and their new holdings in Savannah. It provided an ample opportunity for George Washington to attempt to deal with the Indian problem along the frontiers. If the Western theater of the war had, thus far, existed primarily on the periphery of the fighting, it was about to become the primary theater for 1779. The attacks in the West required a response by the Americans, and George Washington knew it. It was never a theater that Washington was terribly interested in. He had wanted to keep a larger number of men at the ready, so that when D'Estaing was ready to go for a large action, they would be ready. However, following the attacks on Wyoming and the Cherry Valley, Washington was left with little choice. At first, for this campaign, he turned to his primary rival, Horatio Gates. Not that Washington really had any interest in giving his chief rival a chance to show him up. However, the commander felt bound by Gates' rank and seniority. Luckily for Washington, Gates believed that the entire matter was a trap. By this point, Gates felt that he was too old for a frontier campaign and politely declined. So, with Gates out of the way, Washington jumped over Israel Putnam and landed on John Sullivan. Sullivan, desperate for a chance to redeem himself, told Washington that you had me at hello. What Washington approved for the mission was a campaign of total war. Sullivan was instructed to head off towards Fort Niagara and seize it. On the way there, Sullivan was instructed to do everything short of salting the earth. This was to be a campaign of complete destruction, with Sullivan instructed to destroy any village and camp that he came upon. As we are about to see, Sullivan took this advice to heart and was about to launch what remains one of the most brutal campaigns in the history of the United States. During the summer of 1779, the plan was to levy a war on the Iroquois that would force them into, at minimum, neutrality. In addition to the destruction, the army was instructed to take as many hostages as possible to help force the Iroquois' hand. The plan called for one column to march from Pittsburgh and to engage the Senecas. To the east, John Sullivan and James Clinton would take a combined force into the New York frontier. Sullivan and Clinton brought nearly 4,000 Continentals, who were easily able to deal with the 700 combined British, Loyalists, and Indian allies at the Delaware village of Newtown. Although the battle would only result in around a dozen or so killed between the two sides, it would force the Iroquois into a hasty retreat, as they quickly saw that they were badly outnumbered. Really, though, this war was not about large battles that would produce decisive victories. The Iroquois certainly could count and knew that they were badly outnumbered. They had little interest in a direct engagement because they were well aware of how that was going to turn out. However, the real destruction of the battle would come in a different way. As historian Woody Holton puts it, the most significant victory was not against any single tribe, but rather was against the Iroquois food supply. During the course of the campaign, the Continental Army burned 160,000 bushels of corn. We have talked before about how susceptible the Indian food supply always was. As a result of their nomadic lifestyle, they never had a permanent sustainable food supply. A single bad harvest was a disaster. 2 in a row was approaching a catastrophe. The Americans clearly knew this as well, which made the food supply such a high-value target. If the Iroquois couldn't eat, well, then they certainly couldn't fight. We should, however, also consider the wider ramifications about this plan to destroy the food supply. In this endeavor, Sullivan was not fighting directly with an enemy combatant, but rather was undertaking a course of action that sought to destroy their ability to fight. This was not a targeted attack against the tribe's warriors, but rather was an attack against all members of the tribe. The men under Sullivan's command were likewise well aware of those potential ramifications, and spoke about how their mission was one of complete destruction of the Iroquois. Really, there was very little that the Iroquois could do to stop the Americans. They simply lacked the manpower to meaningfully resist the incursion. The reign of destruction through 1779 saw dozens of towns burned and crops destroyed, as Sullivan led that campaign of scorched earth. With the Iroquois unable to do much to slow the Americans down, they fell back towards Fort Niagara, where they were hoping to shelter under the umbrella of British protection. Although the winter at Valley Forge is often seen as being a brutal winter, it was actually the winter of 1779-1780 that would prove to be the harshest winter of the entire war. For the Iroquois refugees who had fled to Niagara, the destruction of their food stores, in combination with those brutally cold conditions, would lead to a humanitarian disaster, producing far more deaths amongst the Iroquois than had been experienced during Sullivan's expedition. The Iroquois would prove to be the biggest loser of the American Revolution. By the end of the war, they found themselves looking at a land-hungry neighbor with few qualms about flooding into their territory and just taking their land. Although the Iroquois Confederacy would survive the American Revolution, the influence that they held over affairs in North America was at an end. It was not an oversight that in 1783 no members of the Iroquois were present for the peace conference. For tribes like the Mohawk, substantial numbers of them moved on into Canada. This depopulation caused the remaining settlements to fall into states of disrepair. The state of New York would ultimately annex much of the land formerly controlled by the Mohawk in the aftermath of the war. As tragic as the outcome of the revolution was to the native tribes, it is difficult to see things going much differently. The proclamation line of 1763 was one of the earliest events of the imperial crisis. Oftentimes, it is not even included inside of that greater crisis. But even with the proclamation line in place to limit westward expansion, as we saw, all it really did was slow the flow of people into the Indian Territory, rather than stop it. Should the Americans win the war, which of course they would, Iroquois lands were always going to prove extremely vulnerable, as American settlers were itching to expand west into the Ohio Valley. Again, quoting historian David Preston, he sums up the entire situation well when he states that, while the Iroquois had maintained their status as a free and independent people, the Revolution and its aftermath greatly diminished their power, population, and lands. The United States thus achieved a preponderance of power over the Iroquois that neither the French nor the British ever possessed. For his role as the commanding officer, Washington was given the nickname Town Destroyer by the Iroquois. However, despite his role as the commander, and to be sure he was aware of the plans along the frontier, Washington himself never did lead troops to the west. During the late spring and into the early summer, Washington found himself dealing with problems in New York. Specifically, the problem came at a place named Stony Point, located some 45 miles north of New York City. Stony Point sat on the western bank of the Hudson River, opposite of Valplank Point. Between Stony and Valplank Point, you had what was the southernmost crossing of the Hudson under American control. Now, this was obviously a strategic location, as the Americans were still acutely aware of the dangers that came from the British gaining control over the Hudson. Recall that Burgoyne's plan had been to link up with Howe, Clinton, or honestly anybody that he could find in Albany, and then cut off New England. Now, although we know that Burgoyne never even sniffed Albany, the Americans wanted to be sure to maintain their control over the Hudson north of Stony Point. On June 1st, Clinton sent some 6,000 troops against Stony Point. The fort at Stony Point was still under construction and provided little protection. With no interest in getting run over by a British army with an overwhelming numerical advantage, the fort quickly fell without so much as a whimper. Across the river, those located at Valplank read the room and likewise surrendered without the need for a battle. This entire ordeal had caused Washington a fair amount of consternation, as he really had no idea what Clinton was going for here. Washington was well aware that a large amount of the British army had left the city and was now moving south. And while this seemed to indicate that a larger attack was not imminent, it was still awfully concerning that here Clinton was suddenly seizing forts along the Hudson. Washington was able to deduce that the real impetus for these British attacks was to increase their ability to forage. while disrupting the American communication lines with New England. After about a month or so of doing absolutely nothing, Washington found himself itching to respond any way he could. Washington decided that the move here was to take a shot at the former American and now British holding at Stony Point. Giving command to Anthony Wayne, the plan was to surprise the British by moving in late at night on July 15th. So concerned with accidentally tipping the British off to their presence, Wayne forbade the troops from loading their muskets and made abundantly clear that any man who jumps the gun and tips the British off would be executed on the spot. The plan worked well, as the Americans were able to surprise the British. 2 Americans disguised as farmers, along with a slave named Pompey, were able to sneak up on the British sentries and capture them before they could tip off anybody as to what was coming. With the element of surprise secured, the Americans attacked. After a period of some brutal, often hand-to-hand combat, Wayne was able to recapture Stony Point. Despite suffering some serious casualties himself, Wayne inflicted over 130 casualties of his own and took nearly 550 men prisoner. Although Washington was feeling pretty good about his victory, he was also aware that holding Stony Point was going to be a difficult venture. Washington biographer John Fairlane writes that Washington had learned from his previous defeats at Fort Washington of the dangers of attempting to hold Stony Point and what that would pose for his army. For Washington to hold Stony Point, it would have required him to place a large number of men in a position where they would be overly vulnerable to the British in New York City. Sure, commanding Stony Point would have been nice and all, and it would have made communications easier. But at the end of the day, it was just never that strategically important. And it just did not justify Washington accepting the substantial risk that holding the fort invited. With that, Washington went ahead, destroyed the fort, and then withdrew. In August, Washington placed Light Horse Harry Lee in charge of a mission against Paulus Hook, located just across the Hudson from New York City. Washington, who by this point had a burgeoning spy network, had intelligence that the British installation on Paulus Hook was vulnerable. Much like with the attack on Stony Point, Washington went into this mission fully aware that holding the fort was a completely unacceptable risk. Rather, the plan was to get in, cause some havoc, burn the fort, and then get out of Dodge. And this is exactly what happened for the most part. On August 18th, Light Horse Harry Lee managed to strike, killing 50 and capturing another 150. Lee realized quickly that the British reinforcements were not exactly far away. Despite the mission objective being the destruction of the fort, Lee decided that that was going to take far too much time. He instead withdrew with his prisoners in hand and called it a day. These 2 seemingly minor engagements were basically all there was for Washington in 1779. Although he had captured no new holdings, both battles were a success for the general. If nothing else, they did much to build and maintain the morale of the men, who otherwise would have spent the years sitting around twiddling their thumbs. Really, at the end of the day, this had been Washington's primary objective. He quickly realized that holding Stony Point was an unacceptable risk. With Paulus Hook, he had come to the same conclusion well in advance of the actual battle. If a secondary, unstated objective had been to annoy Henry Clinton, Washington had succeeded there as well. Although Clinton would have loved to avenge the losses and put Washington firmly into his place, he simply did not have the men to do much about it. Clinton had been hoping for reinforcements. However, by October he had learned that no such help was coming. Clinton would end up abandoning several of his forts along the Hudson to better concentrate his remaining men in Manhattan, in anticipation of an attack from the French and the Americans. Well, Washington would have loved such an attack as well. D'Estaing decided that he was going to spend the winter in the Caribbean. With that, Washington began making his own winter plans that would see the Americans return to Middletown for what would prove to be a particularly brutal winter. The year 1779 also saw the emergence of a naval war. The British were, by a decent margin, the world's leading naval power in 1779. Part of the appeal of the alliance with France is that the French Navy could at the very least stand with the British Navy, something that the Americans could just not do yet. This helps explain why I have spent so much time focusing on the movements of D'Estaing and his French fleet. When you add in the Spanish fleet, which is something that we are going to do in just a few minutes here, the combined Franco-Spanish fleet was a very formidable challenge against the British. To this point, we have not seen much of anything from the Continental Navy. Although John Adams would appreciate the moniker, having put forward the motion in 1775 for the creation of the American Navy, the honorific title of Father of the Navy generally refers to John Paul Jones. Born in Scotland in 1747, by the time Jones turned 15, he was regularly traveling on ships, making the crossing between England and Virginia. After spending several years during the 1760s working on slave ships, Jones ended up becoming a master sailor at the age of just 21. It is here that Jones would establish himself as being a strict disciplinarian, at one point lashing a man to the point that, when he later died, murder charges were tossed in his direction. John Paul Jones would first arrive in Philadelphia in 1775, following another incident where he had killed a man whom he had accused of mutiny. In need of a command, and the Americans in need of naval officers, Jones was about as good a choice as anybody. He said the right things, showed an adequate dedication to the American notion of liberty, and thus received a commission as a first lieutenant. Over the next several years, Jones distinguished himself through a series of naval skirmishes. In 1777, Congress, pleased with the work that Jones was doing, sent him to France with the mission of harassing British merchant ships. During this time, John Paul Jones earned a reputation of being nothing less than a total nuisance for the British. More than once he sailed right into British ports and took it upon himself to cause chaos, and more than his fair share of destruction. By 1778, Jones had become more than just an annoyance, when he burned the ships docked at the port of Whitehaven in northwestern England. Shortly thereafter, Jones would manage to capture the Drake, a British sloop of war, during a naval battle. Although none of this had really caused any real damage to the British Navy, it did cause them a good amount of frustration and more than a little embarrassment. For the American Navy in 1778, there really was not much more than that somebody could hope for. The French were also thoroughly delighted by his exploits, and soon they put him in command of a more formidable ship. Jones did not disappoint, and in August 1779, he set off aboard the Bonhomme Richard, along with a small fleet of 6 additional ships. After spending a few weeks maneuvering with the British, on September 23rd, Jones engaged the British frigate, the Serapis. Without any question, the Serapis was far more modern a ship than the slow, plodding Bonhomme Richard. As you would probably expect, the Serapis was able to inflict heavy damage to the Richard. Serapis captain Richard Preston recognized that he had the battle in hand, so he reached out to Jones to discuss the terms of surrender. To this, John Paul Jones replied with his famous line, "I have not yet begun to fight." Wanting to back his bold words up with bold action, Jones ordered the Richard to sideswipe the Serapis. This had the effect of getting the rigging of the 2 ships tangled up. This sparked off a close-quarter battle between the crews of the 2 ships, as cannons raced to see which ship would be reduced to a pile of splinters first. This went on for a while, until an American grenade managed to find its way through a hatch and into the powder hold. Despite hours earlier being assured of victory, a grenade finding its way into the powder hold was more than enough to get Preston to surrender. The Richard was a complete loss, sinking just a few days later. But hey, that was fine, because now the new American flagship was the Serapis. Accompanied by another one of the now captured ships from the British fleet that had attacked on the 23rd, Jones sailed for the safety of Dutch waters. The American victory over the Serapis was a major morale builder for the United States, in a year that was, generally devoid of any major engagements. Jones would quickly become a hero for his exploits. To wrap up for today, I want to take a look at the newest American ally in Spain. Now, as a quick recap, the Spanish had not been terribly amused by the French deciding to form an alliance with the United States. The so-called Family Pact dictated that any such decision should have been made jointly, which was all well and good until the French decided that they were tired of waiting for the Spanish to come around. For the Spanish, it is not as though they had any problem taking a shot at the British. That actually sounded pretty great. The bigger problem was the implications that came from recognizing the United States. What remained of Spanish power, now long in decline, was largely concentrated in her colonial holdings in the Americas. The last thing that the Spanish wanted was for her colonies to realize that declaring independence was something that they could do. Yet, despite this hesitation, it always felt like more of a matter of when, rather than if, the Spanish would join the war. Spain was always in a more tenuous place. As mentioned a moment ago, their power had long been declining, and they were well aware that they needed to pick their battles carefully. While pushing around the British did look great on paper, the Spanish could hardly afford to come out on the wrong side of another war. Let's not forget that in the not-so-distant past, Spain had more or less stumbled into the 7 Years' War just in time to lose. In a war that was centered largely in the New World, Spain had far more expansive holdings than their French counterparts, and thus had far more to potentially lose. Making matters worse, the entire ordeal had given Spain serious trust issues when it came to France. The Spanish ministry, under the control of the Count of Floridablanca, was worried about what would happen if France suddenly decided that other priorities were more important and decided to abandon the venture with the United States. Should the Spanish align themselves with the French, did that expose them to taking the full wrath of a potential peace settlement, should the war not turn out as they had hoped? The Spanish ministry therefore remained opposed to the war. Vergennes, for his part, also realized that he needed to play it cool, and always stopped short of demanding Spanish involvement under the Family Pact. Ever the pragmatist, Vergennes figured that the Spanish had their price. Everybody has a price. It is just a matter of figuring it out. As it turns out, Spain did indeed have a very specific price. Although the French were floating all kinds of New World holdings, such as the recovery of Florida, Minorca, or Jamaica, none of that was what Floridablanca really wanted. His eyes instead were set on a small rock, just 2.5 square miles in size. They wanted to recover Gibraltar from the British. Floridablanca, understanding that the British were in this fight against both their colonies and now the French, decided that he might just be able to achieve all of his goals without actually having to accept the risks inherent with war. Floridablanca decided to shoot his shot, and instead of going to the French, he went to the British. Now, to be clear, Floridablanca was not offering an alliance with the British. That was not going to happen. Instead, he let the British know that for the low cost of Gibraltar, they could secure Spanish neutrality. Britain, rather than agreeing to the terms, gave an answer that they would take it under advisement, and that they would get back to the Spanish soon. Over the coming months, Spain would continue to reach out for a status update, while the British carefully dodged their calls. The British did not want to part with Gibraltar. Small as it may be, it exists in a strategically important location at the entrance to the Mediterranean. Should the British reject the offer, or really do anything other than hand over the keys to Gibraltar, they risked the likely prospect of yet another belligerent to deal with. Stalling and vague statements seemed to be the better course. Floridablanca fully understood what the British were doing, and understood that short of winning the war, the British were not planning to hand over the island. So, war it was going to be. To play the part, the Spanish decided that they were going to be mediators, and should the British refuse the peace overtures, then Spain would be forced to join the war. You know, to reestablish the peace. During this period in 1778, the Spanish continued to remind the British that, for Gibraltar, they would drop the matter entirely. Of course, the Spanish were not exactly trying to win the Nobel Prize for ending the war. In fact, it was exactly the opposite. They were presenting a peace plan that they were well aware the British would reject outright, forcing Spain's hand and bringing them into the war. The peace, for the United States, would have included essentially forcing the terms from the Carlisle Commission on them. The Spanish really did not care much for what happened between Great Britain and her colonies, but still wanted to stop short of something crazy, like actually letting the United States have independence. The treaty would have retained those areas actively occupied by the British as being full-fledged parts of the empire, while everything else in the United States would have existed in a more confusing, far weakened state. As expected, the British refused the mediation. Historian Samuel Bemis points out that in reality, had the British accepted the Spanish mediation, they actually would have ended up doing far better in the eventual settlement than they did in reality in 1783. Bemis further points out that if the peace had been accepted by the British, it would have put the French in a terrible spot. They would, in essence, have been forced to choose between their newly forged alliance with the United States or maintaining the family pact, something that Vergennes dreaded. In reality, any such peace would have proved to be nothing short of a disaster for the French, and would have severely damaged their diplomatic reputation. The British, however, decided to do the French a real favor and reject the peace conference. With the peace conference now being rejected, the Spanish felt justified in entering into the war against the British. The French and the Spanish agreed that any peace should be jointly decided between the two parties, and that no unilateral negotiations should take place. Furthermore, France agreed that Gibraltar was a prerequisite to any peace agreement. Now, if you are sitting there thinking about all of these agreements that say peace must be agreed to between the two parties, you might be asking yourself, but wait, isn't there a third party? Aren't we, after all, talking about the American Revolution? So shouldn't the United States be part of this as well? Well, no. The Spanish were not yet there. And despite the fact that they were now going to war as an ally of the French, they basically decided to bury their heads in the sand and ignore the fact that anybody else was participating in the conflict. Vergennes did try to sneak in a promise of American independence, however, the Spanish were not having it. Desperate to get Spain into the war, Vergennes agreed to proceed without this critical component of the Franco-American alliance. This tangled mess of alliances likewise meant, if you follow the treaties, that despite no involvement from the United States, American independence was now predicated on the fate of Gibraltar. France could not conclude the war unless Spain got Gibraltar. The United States could not conclude a peace unless France also reached a peace. As convoluted as it may be, though, the United States had secured a new ally, even if somewhat indirectly. With the nexus of the war moving to the south, we are going to take a brief break from the narrative to look at a few other pressing issues during those war years. Now, in full disclosure, there was some activity in the South during 1779, although even that was pretty limited. When we pick back up with the narrative in a few episodes' time, I will double back and cover the events in the South during 1779. Next time, we are going to turn our attention to the constitutions of the states. With the collapse of civil government during the final phase of the imperial crisis, the states would undergo a year-long process of reform, and oftentimes reimagine their own systems of government. Until then, I hope you all have a wonderful 2 weeks. I hope that you are all staying healthy and that you are staying safe. And I will see you back here next time as we discuss the constitutions of the states.